are the body of Christ. In 2018, I began my clinical pastoral education at Princeton Penn Medical Center. And early on in that process, I was identified as somebody who was equipped for mental health chaplaincy. Therefore, the majority of my work there was leading spirituality groups at two very different women's outpatient facilities where I was blessed to hear the stories of both the clients and the therapists tasked with their care. Additionally, I spent my Tuesdays meeting with individuals who found themselves in the locked mental health emergency ward of the hospital seeking care. It was a year of ministry that transformed my understanding of Jesus' healing presence and of God's amazing grace. During my time in both contexts, which even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic were crowded, I met many Agerius, well-to-do, educated individuals who were in despair, and simply at the end of their rope, so to speak. And they dared to fall at the feet of a higher power, begging for healing. I met others like the hemorrhaging woman, those whose names I never received, who were known only to me by their pain, those who were or felt exhausted of all resources to find restoration in their lives, including one woman who had been hemorrhaging grief for years over the murder of her two sons to gun violence. She was a woman who dared to reach out for God's healing presence by sharing her story with others. And I met children, like Jairus' daughter, so many children who were suffering, that I found myself over the weeks every Tuesday filled with dread as I walked the halls of the hospital to the locked ward, praying, "Dear God, please, just don't let them get any younger." Week after week, 17, 14, 13, 10. When I finally arrived one week and sat with a child experiencing deep despair, completely alone, at the age of 8. And I thought, okay, God, I get it. You sent me here to love and serve these children. I'll stop praying this prayer. And instead, I began praying for strength to offer the littlest made in God's image some hope. And then 3 years later, in the spring of 2021, when my own child began suffering depression, I saw in myself Jairus, begging God to lay hands on my son so that he would be made well and live, anxiously waiting on the Lord. I was the hemorrhaging woman who felt shame at my limitations as a mother, furtively reaching out to touch Jesus for his healing presence in the midst of my own grief. The pain we experience in our life's journey is a part of all of our shared humanity. It crosses all boundaries. But so too does God's love, God's healing presence. For while I experienced the despair and hurting of many Agerius in my chaplaincy work, I also witnessed firsthand those moments of healing and restoration. Spirits lifted Talithgum. And I saw God's children begin walking again in their daily lives, despite the fears of those around them that thought all was lost. I witnessed moments of that instant healing connection between women who shared their stories with one another, but also those who had to wait for their healing, stay the course in fear and trembling of God's amazing and awesome healing power, hoping by faith. Chaplains and pastors create sacred space where God may manifest God's healing presence. And yet we are all the body of Christ, one in our shared humanity, one by faith as the body of Christ. And so I began to wonder, what would it look like to create that sacred space together here at God's Love? What might it look like to live in fear and trembling of God's amazing grace by reaching out to one another and sharing our personal stories? How might we be transformed as a congregation through active listening and radical trust so that no one stands outside that healing presence of the body of Christ? Dare we? Dare we expose our shared humanity and be made well in our life of faith together? A couple of weeks ago, when I sat down at our kitchen table with my son, now 17, and his girlfriend, as they ate lunch, I asked him if I could share his story with you as part of my sermon this morning, explaining that I was really sharing my story, but that ours were inextricably linked. He asked which Bible story I was preaching on, which I have to say surprised me. And it led to the most amazing conversation about the text. And he gave me permission to share his story with you today, saying first, because you asked permission, and second, he said, because we need to talk about such things. We don't talk about mental and emotional health enough. His girlfriend, who had stayed mostly quiet during our conversation, added, and I have to say, she sounded quite wistful, I wish my church talked about these things. Dare we? Here? At God's Love? By the faith of Jesus Christ, no one stands outside God's healing presence. Therefore, in faith, we may dare together, in fear and trembling, to reach towards one another for Jesus Christ. And there, experience God's amazing grace. Thanks be to God.